Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here this afternoon, those of you here in the room with me in Paris, and those of you joining us from around the world by the World Wide Web. We're here today to talk about a very important report that's going to be released by the NEA in a special ceremony in Hungary coming up next week. This report deals with the true costs of decarbonization. We are part of the OECD family, and the OECD family has a credo that we have a mission to provide evidence to make sure that policies made around the world to solve various problems are based on true facts, true evidence. And today we're going to talk about the facts associated with the cost of decarbonizing our electricity system. Around the world, countries are making very important decisions about the future of their energy infrastructures. What kinds of technologies to rely on, what kind of systems, what kind of markets. These are very, very important decisions that will affect the future of energy supply in all of our countries, and it really affects the global environment as well. To make the right choices, we need to have the right facts. And this report provides a basis for discussing those facts. I'm very pleased to be joined today by experts who will give you a little more information about this today. To my left is Bernard Sala, who is Director of Research and Development at the EDF Group. He brings a wealth of experience in both the practical aspects of delivering electricity and also research and development and technology issues. So, Bernard, thank you for joining us today. Next to him is Salma Bilbao-Leon, who is the head of the Division of Nuclear Technology Development and Economics at the NEA. She has many years of experience in the nuclear energy area and brings to us a wealth of perspective on issues associated with climate change and energy production. So, Salma, look forward to your comments. And next to her is Jan Kepler, who is senior economist with the NEA, and one of the authors of the study that you'll be hearing about today. This study, the cost of decarbonization, system costs with high shares of nuclear renewables, focuses on our perspectives and the perspectives from an economic standpoint about how to get the best value from nuclear, renewables, and other resources as we move forward with decarbonization. As I mentioned, we'll be officially launching this in Hungary next week. And during that rollout, we will make available that report on the World Wide Web. Today, we're just going to give a preview of those activities in that report. Now, before we begin our presentations, we have a special video address from the OECD Secretary General, Angel Gurria, who would have liked to have been here in person, but he had other responsibilities. So he was very kind to providing this video message. So please, play the video.
Gentlemen, welcome to this webinar on the true costs of decarbonization. Now, we cannot say it enough. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges that we continue to face, and I stress they continue to face. It's not going to go away. Containing global warming to below 2 degrees and protecting our planet and future generations requires bold and decisive action. A key part of this effort is the creation of a robust and resilient low-carbon energy sector. Moreover, for countries to reach Sustainable Development Goal number 7, and I quote, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all, unquote. They must weigh the full benefits and costs of their policy decision. As such, particular focus should be given to the benefits and costs of clean energy generation technologies. Now, with the increasing electrification of industry, transport, buildings, electricity generation will be at the heart of our efforts to reduce carbon emissions. In fact, the new study highlights that holding the increase of global temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius will require a massive effort to decarbonize electricity generation. CO2 emissions from the electric power sectors of OECD countries would need to be reduced by almost 90% by mid-century. Reduced by almost 90% by mid-century. A massive undertaking. And a key question, which is at the heart of the NEA's new study, is what is the electricity system of the future that will enable countries to meet carbon reduction goals in the most cost-effective manner? So, reduction, but cost-effective. We are fortunate enough to have a number of technically mature, low-carbon alternatives at our disposal. Now, solar, wind, of course, hydro, it's a classic, but it's still clean, and of course, nuclear power. So let's make the most out of them. The study shows that in the electricity systems of the future, all these available low-carbon options will need to work together in a reliable, cost-efficient manner. It also highlights the need to implement electricity market designs that are economically and environmentally sustainable. Such important transformation requires strong action from policymakers. Now, what does it mean? What does this mean about action from policymakers? Well, first, it means that governments must foster vigorous investment in low-carbon technologies. It is of paramount importance to provide long-term stability and boost investor confidence in these technologies. Typically, they are very capital intensive, and therefore the confidence in investors is very crucial. And second, we need proactive policies to facilitate what I would call a fair transition for the affected businesses and households, and particularly those in vulnerable regions and communities. No one should be left behind. In fact, no one can be left behind. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, governments have committed to both an ambitious global temperature goal and national actions to limit emissions, discrete, specific national actions to limit emissions. And of course, the two have to be consistent. The national actions have to be consistent with the overall national goal. Yet today, we are neither on track to achieve our environmental goals, nor executing existing policies in a cost-effective way. So we're not getting either of the two. It's time, therefore, to accelerate and scale up our efforts. Thank you.
My thanks to the Secretary General for his remarks, and I think he provides a very good frame for the conversation we'll have this afternoon. Again, I'll emphasize, it's all about having the right facts, the right analysis, to make sure that the policies put in place are the policies that both will achieve our environmental goals, but also do so in a cost-effective and rational manner. To do that, you have to have facts, and the facts is what we will talk about this afternoon. So with that, I invite Jan Kepler to give us an overview of the report that will be released in Hungary next week, and to be prepared to answer questions as we go forward. So, Jan, I give the floor to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Bill. It is a great pleasure to be here this afternoon to present the cost of decarbonization, system costs with high share of nuclear and renewables to you. I wrote this study together with my co-author, Marco Comedo, who unfortunately is not here this afternoon, but who I hope will be listening to this presentation. This study is the continuation of the NEA's work on costs, which has been ongoing for a number of years. And in particular, I want to highlight the study Nuclear Energy and Renewables of 2011, I think, which was sort of a precursor of the study that we'll be looking at this afternoon. But this work is ongoing and part of our work on cost analysis. A little bit of context to the study. The Secretary General of the OECD just mentioned the objective enshrined in the Paris Agreement to hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius. This implies limiting greenhouse gas emission concentration in the atmosphere to about 450 ppm of CO2 equivalent. That means that annual CO2 emissions will have to be reduced. Annual emissions will have to be reduced by 43% on a global level and 61% at the level of OECD countries. For the electricity sector, that is expected to play a key role here, and that contributes about 40% of global CO2 emissions currently, annual emission reductions have to be much more drastic. They will need to decline 73% at the global level and 85% at the level of the OECD countries. I think the Secretary General mentioned 90%, but these are, of course, projections towards roughly 2050. Now, what does that mean in practice? In practice, it means that at OECD countries currently, every kilowatt hour of electricity emits 430 grams of CO2. We have to reduce those 430 grams to 50 grams of CO2, which means we have to divide it by 8 or even more from current levels of emission. That means electricity generation in the OECD will need to become low carbon, and with hydroelectric resources being limited, variable renewables such as wind or solar PV, and of course nuclear energy will need to substitute for fossil fuels. And now this new study analyzes the total cost of the systems of these different electricity mixes, some with a large share of nuclear, some with a larger share of variable renewables, all at 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So we're looking at the cost of achieving a true low carbon electricity system under different constellations. One constant of our work has been the attention that we give to what we call the system costs. Not only the total cost of the system, but also specific costs that are added to the plant level generation costs at the grid level. These system costs are mainly due to characteristics that are associated with variable renewables. You are, of course, aware of the fact that the wind does not always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, and that gives, in fact, rise to what we call profile costs, which basically means the electricity generation mix is changing towards an overall more expensive mix. We also have balancing costs because renewable production is often difficult to predict. And we have an increase in transmission and distribution costs since good sites for renewable production are often distant from load centers. These system costs, they are large and important, and we will provide you some numbers in the following, but they are also very much dependent on the specific characteristics of the country in which we look at them, the existing generation mix, the level of penetration by variable renewables, the load profiles, and the availability of flexibility resources such as hydroelectricity, demand response, storage, or interconnections. In addition to these costs, there are a number of added impacts of these system costs or these system effects, in particular on the load profiles of dispatchable generators. How did we structure these studies? We looked at 8 scenarios with an identical constraint of these 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. We had one base case that was a least cost scenario in which we actually had 0% of variable renewables. That is a function of the cost assumptions that we had that were taken from the study projected cost of electricity generation by IEA NEA by 2015. Things might have changed a little in the meantime. Then we have 4 scenarios with exogenously imposed shares of 10%, 30%, 50%, and 75% of variable renewables in the generation mix. We have one additional scenario, which is sort of a least cost scenario, but this time with anticipated lower variable renewable costs. I just mentioned that 2015, the original cost numbers that we took, is already some years ago. Costs for renewables have come down. I expect it to come down further. So we're looking at what would that mean then in the final mix. And we have 2 sensitivity scenarios that test for the importance of hydroelectric resources and interconnections. Technically speaking, the studies were done on the basis of detailed least cost linear programming models with hourly resolutions. We have 2 zones in order to see the effect of interconnections, a number of technical constraints, mixed integer for those of you who are interested in these things, and we were working together in cooperation with a group of modelers working at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the MIT. All scenarios have identical demand curves, of course the same emission targets, and fixed hydro resources. All other resources come in on their economic merits. We have real data for the VRE production and costs, as mentioned, from IEA NEA 2015. Just to provide some intuition of what variable renewables can do to an electricity system. On the left, you have a system with 10% of variable renewables. The red line indicates the load. You have the characteristic daily, weekly, and annual changes. And if you then reduce the variable renewables as they are produced in reality throughout the year, you will get the blue line, and you see that it basically transposes the red line a little bit lower, and that's then the demand that will have to be covered by the dispatchable resources. Look at the change, what happens if you move from 10% to 75% on the right. It's still the blue line, which is the residual load. But notice, please, that the 0 line is in the middle now. It's no longer at the bottom, it's now in the middle, which basically means we have enormous excess production per year. In fact, 37% of all renewable production is basically wasted, except for a little bit that goes into recharging the storage, the electric storage. You see that the characteristic daily, weekly, and seasonal patterns have become destructured, and this is a very difficult system for the dispatchable operators to work in. We also have a number of technical constraints and so forth, but overall the system is becoming much more difficult to steer. Now let's come, however, to the quantitative results. Perhaps look first on the right towards the different electricity mixes that we obtain in the different scenarios. In the base case, as I said, no variable renewables, only nuclear. then progressively, as the share of renewables increases, more renewables and less nuclear. There's basically a one-to-one substitution between the two. Why is that? Because basically fossil resources, in this case gas, is limited by the 50 grams per kilowatt hour. Coal is no longer included in a 50 gram per kilowatt hour scenario. Let's move to the left, where we see the installed capacity, relatively standard level of capacity for that for a system of that size, with 100 gigawatts, with 30% of renewable resources. That increases by 60%. With 50% renewables, it doubles, and with 75% of renewables, it triples. So much larger capacity as the share of renewables increases. Now, what does that do to costs, which is, of course, the crucial parameter in this study? We have here total costs on the left, and only the system costs, basically magnified, on the right. In green, you have the increase in generation costs, LCOE. In red, you have the profile costs. In blue, you have the increases. In dark blue, you have the increases in transmission costs, and the connection costs in gray. And in light blue, those are the balancing costs. So you see that with the increase in the share of variable renewables, the share or the part of the system costs, of the grid level system costs, increases more than linearly, some would say exponentially, as the share of renewables goes up. You have also an indicator of the level of system costs, not only in absolute terms, but in average cost of electricity. So we're going up from about $65 per megawatt hour to about $130 per megawatt hour on the left. And we broke this down in terms of megawatt hour of renewables. And there you see that you're going up from roughly $7-8 per megawatt hour in the 10% case to slightly more than $50 per megawatt hour in the 75% case. So that means more costs per megawatt hour produced by variable renewables by $50 per megawatt hour, which are their true full costs. You see that the profile costs are the dominant component. As I mentioned, that's the structural shift in the generation mix towards higher cost resources with lower capital costs due to reduced operating hours, which is of course due to this destructuration of the residual demand that we saw earlier. Very quickly, a few specific results of the study. On the left here, you see the impact on nuclear. The different levels indicate the capacity, the installed capacity in function of the variable renewable shares. We go from 10, 30, from 0, excuse me, the blue is 0, then 10, 30, and 50% share of variable renewables. And you see, as you increase the share of renewables, also the cycling of the nuclear power plants increases enormously. Look at the green band at the bottom. We think that, or our data indicates that that cycling is still technically feasible for current nuclear power plants. But of course, the economic sustainability is really becoming a big, big challenge. In the same vein, look at the right. These are price curves for the different scenarios. And the higher the share of variable renewables, the higher is the number of hours during which the price of electricity will actually be 0. The flat lines there at the end means 0 prices. If you have 75% renewables, you'll have 3,750 hours where prices will actually be zero. Of course, we already have some hours with zero prices today, some hours even negative prices, but such high hours, such high numbers of hours would really be a tremendous challenge for the electricity system. The system or the modeling constraint indicates that the system has to cover all costs. That means we have also a large number of hours in which prices are very high, above $100 per megawatt hour. So the key lesson here is we'll have a much, much more volatile electricity system, price-wise, economically, and that increases uncertainty. It will increase the cost of investment and ultimately the risk to capacity adequacy. Remember, all low-carbon technologies, whether nuclear, whether hydro, whether renewables, are technologies with very high fixed costs and don't like volatile prices at all from an investor perspective. And perhaps those who experience the most difficult challenge in these markets are renewables themselves. Due to the fact that it's perhaps easiest to see with solar PV. All solar PV basically produces during a few hours, middays, when the sun is particularly strong. Wind also is very much correlated. And due to that autocorrelation of renewable production, it means that actually renewable resources earn less than the average market value during the hours in which they're produced, because each time when they produce, every other installation produces also, and prices are very low. That's what's shown here. And as you increase the level of VRE penetration, the actual market value of renewables decreases also. So also for renewables, this is not an easy environment, and all technologies there are placed in at a similar level. I come to my last graphic. Look, please, on the right. We're comparing now the two scenarios that are really market-based. There's no longer any share that is being imposed here. On the left, you have the original base case. As I said, no renewables because our cost assumptions were fairly high. Then we have on the right two columns where, in fact, the costs of renewables were substantially reduced, to some extent in line with historical experience, to some extent in line with what we expect to see in the coming years. Photovoltaics are 60% lower, wind onshore 33% lower, and wind offshore 50% lower. And in the two regions, we have these very different results. About 15% of variable renewables coming in on their own merits, endogenously, coming in on their own merits. In the first region, up to about 15-20%, and in the second region, a little less than 50%. That depends on very fine assumptions concerning interconnections, concerning load profiles, concerning production profiles of renewables in the different regions and their correlation. Let's not get into that, but let's take sort of intuitively the average of those, and we're in a system where we have renewables coming in on their own merits in the region of 30-35%, nuclear being there with 35-40%, gas making up the rest, and gas and hydro making up the rest. And that is for us, in fact, sort of a very realistic, a very likely vision of the future, of a future least cost system in which nuclear and renewables will coexist. And in order to make that a reality, policymakers will need to heed a number of policy recommendations. We are at the OECD after all, so every study finishes with a number of policy recommendations. And in order to cost efficiently and radically decarbonize the electricity sector to 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, while maintaining the very high level of security of supply our countries have become used to, requires 5 complementary policy measures. First policy measure that we recommend is to recognize and fairly allocate the system costs to the technologies that cause them. We have to be aware of them. We need to deal with them. We need to take a system approach in the future. There's no use pitting one technology against the other. We need to look at the system as a whole. We also advocate to continue to foster competitive short-term markets for the cost-efficient dispatch of available technologies. They have served us well in the past 20 years. Nevertheless, and that brings us already to point 3, these competitive short-term markets have shown not to be the best instrument to encourage new investment in low-carbon technologies with high fixed cost. There we need additional policy measures to provide stability for investors. Call it feed-in tariffs, call it contracts for difference, call it long-term contracts, but we do need some instrument in order to foster low-carbon investment. As a fourth point, we also need to ensure adequate levels of capacity and flexibility, as well as adequate transmission and distribution infrastructure. We need more of that than we currently have, but the system operators are looking at that, and there's no reason that this should not come forward. And ultimately, that is a little bit our ceterum censeo, do implement a carbon price. It does remain the most efficient approach for decarbonizing the electricity supply. Nobody is naive about the political barriers, but even the most formidable barriers cannot neutralize the fact that it does remain the most efficient approach. It is a necessary element of these policy recommendations. It is not a sufficient condition for success, but it is a necessary one. So successfully decarbonizing the electricity sector requires suitable policies for the rapid deployment of all available low-carbon technologies, in particular variable renewable resources and nuclear energy, in the most cost-effective manner. Thank you very much. Back to you, Bill.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jan. I appreciate the overview for this. You covered a lot of ground, and we'll have time to chat about this. But before we begin the conversation, let me invite Bernard to make a few remarks and give his perspective from the power producer standpoint.
Thank you, Bill. First, I would like to say that it's really a great honor and a great pleasure to be here with you to explain our experience and to explain what EDF is doing and what is our global strategy. So first, to have some reaction perhaps on what was explained, let me give you some key items of our global strategy. The first element is really decarbonization. So for big utility, decarbonization is now a huge priority. EDF results are really good. Our emissions in France are roughly around 25 only gram per kilowatt hour of electricity. So decarbonization is for us a real motto for the future. The second idea is about electrification. So the driver for decarbonization is electricity. It means that the share of electricity is going to increase. If electricity is decarbonized, electricity is a way, in fact, to decarbonize the global economy, the global industry. So electricity has a bright future. Third idea, I totally agree with what was said. The future mixed is a sort of assembly of different solutions. We need to develop renewable, hydro, but also variable renewable, because the cost is really going down. Nuclear has really a big place to take because it's the only dispatchable generation which is CO2 free. It is the only one, so it has really a significant place to take. On top of that, demand management could play also a role. For example, electrification of the mobility, of the transportation, heat pump for building heatings. So demand and flexibility could play a role. Is a nuclear compatible with variable generation? The answer is really yes. Our French experience, because of our big share of nuclear, you know, we have 70%, 75% of our total electricity generation, which is coming from nuclear. So we experience flexibility of nuclear for 30 years. I can tell you it works. It works. So I could give you more detail during the discussion, but it works and it is feasible and it is economic.
Bernard, thank you very much for your comments. We have a variety of questions, but let me go back to you, Jan, because as you went through this presentation and discuss the system costs, and I want to give you a chance to elaborate on how to calculate system costs and what they mean in reality. One might take from your presentation that this is a matter of nuclear versus renewables. And I know that's not by any stretch what you're saying, but I want to give you a chance to talk about that and to give a perspective on how nuclear renewables should be seen in the context of a report like this and in the context of system costs.
Yes, thank you, Bill. The report sort of tried to start from sort of what we observe in the real world around us. Renewables are considered quite attractive by voters and by policymakers, and we have a number of measures of actually putting them into the system. And we know then the deployment of renewables is not market-driven, but is provided through policy, a variety of policy measures with different effects. And so we are really asking, what are the additional economic costs of these policies? Now, that's basically, as I said, on the assumptions of the costs that we had in 2015, the last study that we did together with our colleagues from the IEA. On those numbers, we see that's still very much more expensive if you sort of impose these outside constraints. However, and that was a little bit the message of the last slide, if we really think that renewables will go down in costs, then they will actually enter the system on their own merit. And then it becomes actually interesting in sort of an economic sense. Why? Because on the one hand, you have renewables whose LCOE costs, sort of the plant level generation costs that we're all familiar with, might actually become lower than those of nuclear. Now, does that mean that nuclear will go out of the system? Not at all, because you'll need a mix of dispatchable and non-dispatchable technologies in your system, and there's sort of an intrinsic effect of the variable renewables that will sort of stop their deployment. That has to do with the lowering of their system value. That basically, to make a very simple example, if you have only solar at night, you would still need nuclear. I mean, that's really the most basic example, but it's a bit more complex in reality. You all know this, but that's basically the effect. So I really see a future least cost system to establish itself somewhere at some sort of economic equilibrium between those two technologies.
Thank you very much. Sama, let me turn to you at this point, because one of the questions I'm looking at here relates to the fact that the technologies are evolving, that much of the technology that we are talking about in terms of nuclear today are the traditional large light water reactors that have a certain cost structure and originally were intended as baseload power plants, although as Bernard pointed out, there's a lot of experience in load falling. I think he wants to mention that again. But as we look into this is a long-term prospect to decarbonize the electricity system. How do you see advances in technology having an impact on this as we go forward? Do you see the situation evolving from both a nuclear to a renewable standpoint? Can you speak about that a bit?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Yes, I agree that the nuclear technology that we have used in the past may not meet exactly what the markets of the future are going to be. So, but while there is going to be still some need for base load and these more traditional, more conventional light water type reactors may still have a place in the future, perhaps. Maybe we are looking into additional technologies that are going to have, well, the same levels of safety that we are seeing currently, or even improve levels of safety. But maybe we are going to take advantage of the nuances of the new market. So like, for example, we are looking into small modular reactors. So these are going to be plants that, because they have a smaller size, may be located more distributed into the grid, and they may be able to take advantage of the variability of the grid maybe more easily. And of course, one of the things that we also see is the cost of nuclear. As we know, the cost of nuclear, particularly in some markets, the construction of new nuclear power plants maybe has not yet been as low as we all would like to see it. So perhaps going to these new technologies that are going to be maybe more affordable, smaller size, that can be perhaps be deployed in a more serious fashion, that could take advantage of the markets. And then finally, another thing that we are seeing is that maybe some of these advanced technologies are going to be able to extend the product that nuclear energy can produce to things other than electricity. So we are looking how these nuclear power plants can start being considered in the heat markets, in the supporting the industrial markets. So there may be some additional, let's say, hydrogen, fresh water, etc. So all those things not only can help make the economic case when we are looking into dispatchable and flexible technologies, but as I say, may help expanding the range of products that nuclear energy has traditionally given.
Thank you very much. Bernard, back to you, because this is really not an issue of so much as nuclear, renewables, or other technologies. It's really about the system. And one thing that struck me in Jan's presentation is that we're moving towards systems that seem to be moving in the direction of having large time slots of zero price electricity. As someone who's in the business of making electricity, that can't possibly excite you very much. And I wanted you to make a comment about what you see happening in the future when it comes to, because we do see this in a lot of markets, zero price electricity, even negative electricity. What's the effect of that? And is that a sustainable situation?
Well, here in Europe, we experience zero price, zero value price last year. The time period and the time duration was not so long. By the way, we had 2 or 3 times where we got that. Even if the volume of renewable energy which have been developed in Europe, especially in Germany at the moment, is really big. So in Germany, for example, you have at the moment roughly 40 to 50 gigawatts of solar and 40 to 50 gigawatt of wind, which mean that when wind and solar are working together in, let's say, spring or autumn period, they can, at noon, completely fill the necessary load and the necessary demand. Of course, having a zero price is not a good solution. The key question we need is to have a long-term view of the price of electricity, and especially with those big assets like a nuclear power plant. I also completely agree with what Horst said. Renewable, and especially variable renewable, the cost is going to go down, and probably tomorrow they will be in the market. They will be market price. Whereas for big assets, and especially big dispatchable assets, which are huge investment, we need a long-term view. So whatever the mechanism would be, we need a long-term view. And the value of this asset is not only based on the energy that they deliver. I mean, it's not based only on the kilowatt hour they deliver, but it's mainly based on the guarantee of power they deliver. So it's not a question of kilowatt hour, it's rather a question of kilowatts. So to answer in a short word your question, the long-term view. We need a long-term view from the regulator in order to be able to manage those investments. Otherwise, we as utility, we are not going to invest.
Well, let me stick with you for just a moment and sort of follow up on that, because to get from where we are today, which from Jan's presentation is a place where we see these zero price electricity, we see these the lack of policies that would encourage the investments in the technologies that we need for the low carbon electricity system. How do you think the market structure has to evolve to get us to that point? What's missing today from your standpoint?
We believe that the market tomorrow is going to be more complex, because in fact the assets we are going to have are going to be very different. Conventional generation is completely predictable, dispatchable. Variable generation, it could provide low price electricity, but you cannot exactly control the moment when you have this electricity. And on top of that, you have also the flexibility market. I mean, if tomorrow we have a big electrical vehicle market with a lot of batteries of this EV, with a V2G vehicle to grid system, if it is possible, well, I'm not so sure at the moment, but it could be. So in that case, we are going to have a much more complex system. And it means that the market should take into account those different way of generating and using electricity. So kilowatt hour, regulating the price, kilowatt hour, but also regulating the power, the kilowatt, and regulating the flexibility. So at the moment, of course, we have a market for the price, kilowatt hour. Capacity market are appearing in Europe. Flexibility, perhaps it's a more long-term issue. But, well, the regulation should adapt and should fit with the different technology that we are going to manage.
Thank you very much. I have a question that's come in. I think I'll address to the whole panel, but perhaps start with Jan. And that is, the question is that it's been suggested that solar needs some form of dispatchable power at night to back it up. And the question is, isn't the real economic question one between generation and storage technologies? And how do you see the price of storage behaving in the future, and how does that play into this discussion?
Thank you. I'm happy for this question. Expected it to some extent. I think if we talk about storage, we need to be clear about one thing. About which time frame are we talking? Are we talking in the second or minute range? And there's quite a lot of going on storage there. Are we talking in the hourly or daily range, which would sort of be interesting for solar PV? Or are we talking the seasonal range? And sort of the question of intermittency and variability, in fact, sort of expects answers in all three ranges. And I think it gets more intractable as we move out on the time scale. I think we're making a lot of progress, and what we see in sort of the second and minute range, and a lot of new operators in these flexibility markets are active that were mentioned, and a lot is happening both on the technological level and on the economic level. Where it looks very intractable, in fact, in pure storage terms, is really sort of on the seasonal level. In some countries, you have more sun, of course, in the summer, or more wind in the winter. What you do when you don't have that, then you need backup. That's costly and all that. So storage for that kind of problem is not really available. And I think the most where the public is waiting most eagerly is, of course, in the hourly range. Can we sort of have a power pack in the garage that sort of helps us through the night and all that? And I think what we see, there's quite a bit of hype. There's a lot of people who are looking for solutions. I don't think we're there yet. I really don't think we're there yet. That solar PV plus battery can substitute for, I don't know, a gas or nuclear supply, despite the headlines that we see. Let's wait and see. Perhaps in 5 or 10 years we're there, but not now.
So, did you want to comment?
I don't really have much to add to that. The only thing that maybe I would say from maybe different point of view is that, for example, if we were going to use nuclear in a dispatchable or flexible way, that could also be a source of energy storage. So we could use excess nuclear electricity, store it, and use it in combination with, say, variable renewables, say solar, wind, whatever. So yes, there is the maybe traditional point of view of batteries, which is what we always think when we are looking about storage. But again, technology is moving many parallel directions and maybe different ways to use storage.
Bernard, please.
Yes, perhaps a few comments. With the increase of variable regeneration, so we need not exactly storage, but additional flexibility. We need to find flexibility. And you have different solutions to do that. The first one is the grid by itself. So the grid is a way, in fact, to share electricity generated in different location in which you have sun, location in which you have not, location in which you have wind, location in which you have not. If you take the situation of the market in Europe at the moment, there is no market for new pump hydro storage. I mean, pump hydro storage is the cheapest way of building storage. And you have many places in Europe, in Switzerland, in Norway, where you could build such pump hydro storage facilities. But at the moment, there is no market. It means that the grid by itself and the conventional generation is sufficient to provide this need of flexibility. Our experience is that in the great European grid, the need of storage exists, but it's not so big. Frankly, it's not so big. It could be completely different in small system. So EDF operate small system in small islands, you know, the La Réunion Island, for example, for which microgrid, like Guyana, for which microgrid accommodating renewable energy plus storage could be really efficient, because in fact you compare those systems to diesel genset, for which the price of fuel is very, very high, the carbon impact is also very bad, and so the comparison in that case could be really in favor of this system of having PV wind plus storage, plus perhaps a genset, but a very small one.
Let me push you a bit more on this, what you just said, because as I think you noted in your comments earlier, the trend is towards electrification, to use electricity to deliver energy in more forms than in the past. And of course, the most prominent example that's been discussed recently is electric vehicles, for example. So we're on the verge of having economies in OECD countries which will be more reliant on electricity than they are today, which is quite a statement when you know how reliant we are. And at the same time, the prospect exists to have a greater share of that electricity coming from variable renewable resources. So as you project out, say 20, 30 years from now, and you see those trends continuing, are you still confident that the need for storage is relatively modest in the European situation?
Well, of course, it's very difficult to say. Our calculations show that we have additional need of storage, not so big, perhaps for the European market, tens of gigawatts at the 2035, 2040 horizon, but perhaps no more than that. What we believe is that the grid, as I mentioned, the existing conventional generation, the flexibility of the demand by itself could be the way to provide this additional flexibility. Take the EV. If the number of EV in the market is really big, and if V2G is working, then the price of storage through the EV is going to be very low. So I have two if, so I'm not so sure it's going to work, but it could be a tremendous game changer.
Interesting, thank you. Samet, I'm going to have a question that I'd like to aim your way, and that is one of the people looking at today's discussion is curious as to our thoughts about the competitiveness of nuclear coming from Western suppliers. And the note is made here that that particularly Russian and Chinese suppliers seem to be in a very strong position in the markets. They seem to have a lot of advantages in terms of financing, and the foreign policies of the countries are kind of encouraging their suppliers to be very expansive. So what's your outlook on that? Do you see sort of the traditional suppliers from France and the US and Japan and countries of that nature, do you see them still competitive in the future, or do you see a big shift coming? Or perhaps the shift is already here?
Well, I think that clearly we have seen that recent projects in Western countries, whether it's in North America or in Europe, perhaps, I mean, they are first-of-a-kind projects, which of course always have added costs and added uncertainties, but certainly they haven't really told a very good economic story when it comes to new nuclear power. And that, of course, is in contrast, as you said, with our colleagues in Russia or in China who are very well, I mean, they are doing that much more effectively than we are. So several things that I think. I think that part of the reason why we are seeing those differences is because in the traditional supplier, Western Europe, North America, maybe the supply chain is being weakened for the lack of construction in recent years. So this is an area in which definitely if we manage to strengthen that supply chain so it is reliable and robust and the prices are appropriate, we may see a little bit improvement on the construction costs. At the same time, another thing that we are forecasting is that many of these, it used to be that many of these nuclear construction projects tend to be very, very country-based. And we are thinking that perhaps the way to ensure the success of these construction projects is when they become more global, when they actually will see more partnerships and more collaborations among the different countries, among the different suppliers. So we really see that is going to enhance the price. But I think that one thing that is clear for all of us is that the price and the effectiveness of new nuclear projects needs to be improved. Clearly, the price needs to come down a little bit, and we really need to demonstrate that, in fact, we are able to build these projects on time and on budget. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the markets are going to have a huge impact. So we really need to have markets that somehow in the price of the market, there is a signal that is going to encourage the long-term planning, the long-term investment, in which case all those projects are going to also make more sense.
Jan, do anyone want to make a comment about any of that? Please, Bernard.
Yes, I think that this question of competence of the Western industry is really a key aspect in the price and the difficulty we met for delivering those new generation free unit. I think there is another aspect, which is the theory aspect. our experience in France was that our nuclear fleet was a significant success because of the Syria effect. If you look at the Chinese at the moment, they are building the same plants, all the same plants. And the Russians the same, they have their VVR 1000 and, well, it's the same model. They are delivering it, small change perhaps, but the same model. And so the question is how we have some visibility to be able to deliver new series project. And so these come back to the vision of long-term view of the revenue of new nuclear in order to be able to make commitment on the long term with the industry to be able to develop this series effect.
Thank you. Good comment. Jan, I have a question for you, and this relates to one of the characteristics of the study is the sample of the quantity of renewables on the grid, and you have a zero case, and you go 10%, 50%, 75%. It's been observed that renewable prices are dropping quite significantly, and when you project that they will continue to drop. So one might think that if renewable prices continue to decline, that the question would have to be asked, so what is the role for nuclear? Why bother if you can go up to 75%, and some people have even said higher percentages of renewables, then what's the point even having the conversation about nuclear? So I guess, I'll actually respond to that, but really in the context of what your view is about the practicalities of what's in your own study about, say, 75% renewables. Is that a projection in your view as to what is possible, or is that just more of a basis for calculation? And I'll give you a chance to chat about that.
No, I mean, basically it's two questions. I mean, the first one is whether there still is a role for nuclear. And we think yes, and not only because we're the Nuclear Energy Agency, but as Mr. Sala said, it's the only dispatchable low-carbon technology that's not constrained by natural resources. So if we really want to be serious about decarbonizing 50 grams per kilowatt hour, if we want to go further, even more so, but even arriving at 50 grams, I think would be a huge achievement. So there clearly is a role for a dispatchable low-carbon technology. Now, the second point, or the second part of your question is a difficult one, but also a very interesting one. And we've struggled a little bit with that while we were doing the study. Because when you're really having 75% of variable renewables on the system, the ramp rates, you saw that in the one slide there that I showed, are just enormous. And you're getting technical challenges that we're unable to model in that particular modeling environment that we were working in. And so to some extent, we are on the conservative side in terms of sort of highlighting the system cost of variable renewables. There might be a number of technical constraints really working with such high shares of variability that we just don't foresee yet. I'm quite skeptical that this could actually really work out without the new breakthrough technology, or really, as was mentioned, demand response really being generalized and coming up with enormous gradients in very, very short time, which is costly, but maybe it's still the lowest cost of getting there. I think the verdict is still out to tell you my conviction. I think what we have experienced and are now systems with 30-40% of variable renewables. Denmark, for instance, is often cited, looks very nice, but then you find out it has Norway right next to it, huge hydroelectric reserves for flexibility. So I think we don't really know what's happening as soon as we go beyond 40% of wind and solar right now.
Bernard, can you react to that? Speak about 75% renewables, or what's realistic?
75%, frankly speaking, it's really big. We made with an EDF a study a few years ago called 60% renewable in the global European system. And in the 60%, we had 40% variable generation, variable renewable, and 20% hydro, so dispatchable. When you have 40% variable generation, even at the European scale, you can have some days on some period of a few hours during which 100% of the power is provided by variable generation. So the question is not the average, but the question is the peak. So it means that at the European scale, if you have during a few hours all the power which is provided by variable generation, and a few hours later, no wind or less wind, no sun, it means that you have to start up again 200, 300 gigawatt of conventional plant. So, you know, I'm an engineer. Starting 200 gigawatt of conventional plant in a few hours, theoretically, it's possible. But the risks are huge. The risks are huge. So is it feasible? Difficult to say. I would be really very, very cautious. And as electricity, you know, you cannot live without electricity. You cannot take any risk of having blackout or even blackout at a small scale. So, well, we really need to be sure that it works on a technical point of view before assuming those huge value.
Let me follow up on that just briefly, because what I agree with your comment on this. I think it hits the note correctly. But if you look at, and as Jan pointed out, a lot of this depends on the view you take. Are you talking about hours? You're talking about days? Or are you talking about seasonal? And one question that in fact Jan and I were chatting, sort of emailing about this earlier, is that the grid has this prospect of having disruptions. You know, severe weather is a good example. So, you know, there's been some talk about the severe snowstorms that were held in certain parts of Europe. If you have severe, very low temperatures, high amounts of snow in the wrong place, you know, you can take, you know, capacity offline. And the response, and I asked someone this question some time ago at a conference, and the response was, well, it's kind of what you just said. We would have to turn on the dispatchable power sources, whatever that is, gas, coal, whatever, when that happens. And that, to me, raises a very bizarre question, which is, does that mean we would have large amounts of fossil fuels sitting around waiting for a snowstorm? And how do you do that? How do you even pay for that? How does that work?
Well, it's again the question of regulation, but perhaps to answer your question, let's take an image. Take an hospital. Every hospital have a small genset to provide electricity in case of events, in order to be sure to have electricity for the doctors when they're operating the people. So how do you pay for this genset? Well, it's a sort of safety or security of the system. And so my view is that conventional and dispatchable generation, and above all CO2-free conventional generation, has a real value as a guarantee of power. Perhaps you know that better than I, but I remember that after the storm which hit Puerto Rico very, very hard, and La Dominique very hard, the French territory, in Florida, the only unit working was the nuclear power plant, which was there.
Yeah, that actually is not uncommon in a lot of severe situations. There was a very severe winter in the Midwestern U.S., I don't know, 10 years ago or so, and essentially nothing was working except for the nuclear plants. And I think that's something that needs a lot of careful consideration, because lives depend on the availability of energy in severe weather situations, and that's something that's worth giving thought to. Let me sort of go back to something that Jan said at the very end of his presentation, and Jan, give you a chance to expand on this. And you projected what you saw as sort of a future least cost system. which was, I thought, a nice way to end it. But why don't we pick that up again? And can you elaborate on what you see as a future least cost system and what leads you to that, that sort of breakdown of technologies?
Yes, thank you. I think to some extent, I already tried to sort of provide indication that it's sort of a trade-off between a continuous decrease in the costs of variable renewables, in the plant level costs, but at the same time an increase in their system costs. And so these two forces go in different directions when you're basically increasing their share in the system, and that will sort of lead to some sort of equilibrium. You have nuclear, which is basically stable. I mean, it's batchable. We know what the costs are, and its service is sort of known. And then I basically see it as I said, as a race between the declining plant level costs and the increasing system costs of renewables. And what we need to underline here is that the system costs are really extremely system dependent. It depends on your mix. It depends on your natural resources. It depends on the relative share of wind and solar PV. It depends on the interconnections. It depends on the demand side responses on other storage facilities, in particular hydro pump storage. So it really depends then on that environment. So the answer will not be the same for all countries. But I think the main forces that will sort of shape that system will be the same in all countries.
And broadly speaking, what does that system look like?
I don't know, but let's sort of in an average country, to make it very simple, make it 1/3 nuclear, 1/3 variable renewables, 1/3 gas, and well, I have 3/3. I'm done. Let's make it 30-30-30, and I have still 10 left for the hydro resources that you will have in several countries. Thank you.
Bernard, do you want to react to that?
Well, I agree. The question is that if you really want to have these 50 gram per kilowatt hour, the share of gas has to decrease. Yeah. And so it means that renewable has probably a bigger part to play, variable renewable too, and perhaps other renewable, hydro, biomass, or things like that, which could add on top of the game. The objective of 50 gram is really a very, very ambitious one.
Well, let me ask, so we've had this conversation, we talked about the prospect for vulnerabilities caused by bad weather or just circumstances. So who regulates this? Who's responsible for making sure the lights don't go off? Is it your responsibility as a power producer? Is it the regulator? Who's got the blame if the lights all go off and the power is not there when people need it?
So I can answer for the case of France. So in France, the main responsible for the stability of the grid is the RTE, so the transportation company. And in our system, we call it responsable d'équilibre. So I don't know how to translate that. Is responsible of the equilibrium of the system. So each generation company and each producer has his own responsibility on his own perimeter of sales. And at the global country level, the RTE is making the global equilibrium. And if each producer may have a gap between what he is generating and what he sells, he has to compensate it. If he cannot succeed, he has a blame. And on technical point of view, RTE is going to trigger some measures in order to have this additional generation, or asking some big users of electricity to go out of the grid to curtail their demand or to curtail their generation.
Okay. Yes, please, Jan.
If I can just add to that compliment. Overall, I think these systems with sizable shares of variable renewables are more and more complex systems, both technologically and institutionally. Overall, today running an electricity system in an advanced country such as an OECD country is a hugely complex undertaking. And there's a little bit of race between sort of the issues posed by the variability of renewables and also by their unpredictability and sort of the technical and institutional solutions that are being found. I don't know, more sophisticated balancing markets, frequency markets, capacity markets and all that. And we have sort of the French expression is a millefeuille, sort of a layer cake of different measures, which is harder and harder to understand even for those who work very closely on a daily level with the system. So not to say it's impossible, but it's difficult. And it will cost additional resources only in terms of the management and so forth to make such systems work.
Jan, let me stay with you for just a moment because Bernard had given his thoughts about how the need for storage is somewhat modest, and that which is a bit different from, I think, the conventional thinking when it comes to renewables. So one of the questions that we received deals with the business case for storage versus other ways of balancing the supply, you know, the backup supply or alternatives. How do you see the business case for storage evolving as we go forward?
Well, I think we were all a bit surprised the last few years of how, unfortunately, how bad the business case for storage was in Europe. Let me just give you an example. How do storage providers make money? They buy their electricity cheaply, mainly overnight, and they sell it expensively, mainly during the days, in particular the midday peak. Now, what is happening? You have solar PV, and basically prices during the midday peak are no longer very different from what they are around the day, and the business case for hydro pump storage really collapsed in Europe, and these units are being sold off when everybody says we need them desperately. You said it exactly rightly. There is, of course, a competition between different flexibility providers. There is storage. There are interconnections, the grid. There's demand response. And there is, was mentioned by Sama, dispatchable production. And all these four are in competitions on these flexibility markets. And to some extent, right now, there is enough flexibility resources, at least in Europe, which I know well, better than the other OECD regions. The prices are not that high, and a lot of people are very disappointed actually, because there is a lot of hype, there is a lot of expectations, and I think we all have at one point or other thought that market would sort of take off in a lot more vigorous way. But right now, prices don't indicate there's a huge lack of flexibility in the market. That's all.
It's very interesting. Sama, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, I mean, part of the reason why this is this way in our OECD countries, Western, North American countries, is because we are building these new resources, these renewable resources, on top of fairly robust, fairly well intertwined, interlinked grids. But of course, these assumptions and these behaviors may be completely different as we go to new markets. So if you are looking at developing countries or economies in transition that are really unlike OECD countries, are seeing a huge demand increase, that they don't have the infrastructure and the connectivity that we have, then those needs may change. So that is a whole different business model that, well, we just, I mean, that's not what we studied in this particular report, but that would change perhaps the outlook.
Yeah, as EDF, we recently built big storage project in US and also in UK with battery. In UK, for example, we built a 50 megawatt storage unit with battery. The question was ancillary services for the grid. I mean frequency control. And so there is a real market at the moment for this sort of activity. The depth of this market is perhaps not so big, but well, there is a market. For storage and for big capacity, for big batteries, the market, frankly, is not really there if you have one use. But if you have several use, it could be a little bit different. Ancillary services, this question of taking profit of the spread of price, difference of price between day and night and things like that. There could be also question of avoiding temporary reinforcement of the grid. In case of development of renewable, you put a battery, and it could be interesting to manage it. You could have black start. For the grid, it's also something which has some value. So the capability to start again the grid after an event. And so the question is to find a list of different services, and when you add all of them, so you are able to find sufficient revenue for the storage system.
Yeah, Jan.
Just a very, very small point in addition to that. Currently, we do not have a strong carbon constraint. And that basically means if you need flexibility, building an open cycle gas plant is probably still cheaper than building a new battery. And that might change as soon as we do get a carbon constraint.
Yeah, that relates back to your third approach and your comment that if you're trying to get the carbon intensity down, then you have to bring down that third of gas. But when you look at this from a market standpoint, the gas is very, very competitive. You really need to have a very, very strong signal to not build gas. And in fact, in some markets, gas is overwhelmingly the preferred energy choice. So unless you have that kind of carbon.
There is a point we have not discussed up to now, which is the question of carbon capture and storage. And so making together carbon capture and storage and gas generation could be also a part of the solution. So it's a difficult topic. A lot of projects have been cancelled. Well, but maybe perhaps in the far future solution, storage or usage of this carbon.
Do you remain optimistic about carbon capture and storage?
Frankly, we do prefer not generating any carbon rather than storing it. And so our view as EDF is really nuclear and renewable. Gas perhaps, but well, gas you have to cope with the problem. It's better to avoid generating this carbon.
I'll accept that answer. Another technology that I have a question about, Sama, I'm going to give this one to you, so don't blame me later for this. Fusion. So how does fusion change the picture if fusion appears in, say, 30 or 40 years? Do you see fusion as a major game changer in the future?
Well, I mean, we will have to see the business case. Of course, I don't know when and how, number one, fusion would become commercially available, and then what would be the actual price and the cost of this electricity. But I guess the idea is that fusion would be a dispatchable energy source. So in that sense, if we can integrate it in this, I guess to me the big picture is this. So the ultimate goal here is to decarbonize the electricity grid. So we don't really need to close any door to any technology. So when fusion, if and when fusion becomes available and is at the right price, it will be, I think it will be one of the tools that we need to consider to achieve this decarbonization.
Jan, I have a Twitter question here. And I'm going to just try to read this because I'm having a hard time decoding it, but maybe it'll speak to you because you live in this world. So the question is, does the study consider life cycle embedded energy/carbon costs of variable renewable energy equipment, high material throughput through harvest dilute energy, and also short plant life, 20 to 30 years versus 60, 80 years for nuclear?
No and yes. We didn't consider the carbon embodied in the let's say in the steel that is used in the different technologies. We only looked at emissions produced during generation. And the second point was whether we looked. Yes, of course, the plant level costs are calculated with expected lifetimes that are very different, and which are, as you read, I think 24 solar, 25 for wind, and 60 for nuclear.
I have another question here that I'd like to aim at. I believe this is a good question for Bernard. If I have this, I see we're running out of time. Well, since we're running out of time, let me skip the last question. Sorry, question asker, we won't get to you. And give each of you just maybe 30 seconds to give any final thoughts. And I'll go this way. Jan, why don't you start?
Thank you very much. Well, this is the second study on system costs by the NEA. I think we've advanced, but there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered. Some of them have been asked here. We've tried to sort of give our own opinion, but I think that's a field of research that's still very much in need of commitment, of resources, and of further work. And we hope that this study sort of spurned some of that future work.
Sama?
I guess my take-home message would be the electricity markets and actually energy markets, as we mentioned, because they all are starting to integrate and come together, are changing incredibly fast. And I think that the technology is trying to catch up with it and is mostly or getting there. But I really think that the markets and the policies need also to catch up with the changes that we are seeing. So and this is some of the take-home messages that we have had from this study. So how, well, yes, in addition to these short-term markets that perhaps optimize the dispatch of the different technologies, we really need to make sure that we integrate in our energy markets other very important and valuable aspects such as capacity, flexibility, and also, frankly, I mean, given this interconnectivity, we really need to make sure that there are price signals that encourage investment in all those things, but also infrastructure.
Bernard?
I would say that the future of energy is electrification. In that future, nuclear energy has really a real place to play, together with renewable, together with flexibility. The question is how we build first the technology. As you mentioned, we need to build new plants in an affordable and predictable way, and how we build the regulation in order to make this much complex system affordable and feasible.
Well, thank you, Bernard, and thanks to all of you for your comments this afternoon. I believe we're just about out of time, so...
Thank you for attending today's webcast. We'd like to remind you that the materials presented here are available online and can be downloaded on the NEA website at www.oecd-nea.org. And if you registered for this webinar, we'll be sending you the link to download the full report, the costs of decarbonisation, system costs with high shares of nuclear and renewables, as soon as it's released on January 25th. For more updates and news, we also encourage you to follow us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you. Thank you very much.